So when my co-founder Max told me, hey, I'm going to start a wasabi farm, do you want to join me? I didn't think twice. I just told him right there and then, sure, I'm going to quit tomorrow and I'll join you. So Max actually moved to Japan before we started the company, and we lived together and we visited many wasabi farms. And wasabi farms are actually a very close-knit community and a secretive community. They're not willing to share their generational knowledge to the outsiders, which makes sense. They've made money that way. On the very last day of our, I guess, training, the wasabi farmer was actually, asked us to invest in our company as well.
So Shun, your background is totally different career, right? So could you please tell us?
Sure, yeah. So I actually grew up in the US, moved to New York when I was in elementary school from Kyoto. And from there and on, I lived in New York all my life. And in college, I actually studied engineering. I've always wanted to be an engineer. I loved physics. So that was my passion back then. But then I interned in a financial company. I actually interned at UBS, which is a Swiss investment bank. And I was an engineer then. I was an engineering intern.
Really?
Yeah, a software engineering intern. And I hated my job, actually. My dad has always told me, it's not what you do that's the most important, it's really who you work with. And when I saw the trading floor at UBS, it immediately struck me where people were just going left and right and, talking to each other and engaging with their clients. And the people skill that they had mastered was something that really strongly appealed to me versus my industry of engineering where, you really sit alone. You could work from home and just work with your computer by yourself. I couldn't see myself doing that long term, so I switched to finance. So from there and on, I worked in the financial world. I interned at JP Morgan right after, and then I ended up working at Citi on the trading floor as a salesman. I was trading and selling and trading Japanese government bonds to hedge funds, which was an amazing job, a great experience. But as someone that grew up near farms with all my parents and my grandparents being all farmers, I knew agriculture was in my blood. So when my co-founder Max told me, hey, I'm going to start a wasabi farm, do you want to join me? I didn't think twice. I just told him right there and then, sure, I'm going to quit tomorrow and I'll join you. So, that morning I went to work. Trading floor starts very early. I was there by 6:30 or so. And I told the entire floor, hey guys, I have to quit today. This kind of thing, because of security reasons, usually at a normal job, you would give a 2 weeks notice and say, hey, I will quit in 2 weeks. On a trading floor, you have to say it the day of, and you're not allowed to disclose that to anyone else. So I went in at 6:30 and, right there and then I told everyone I'm quitting, not to go to a competitor or a hedge fund or a VC or PE. I'm quitting to be a wasabi farmer. I'm going to be a farmer. And yeah, everyone's screaming. They're saying like, what is that? Like, why are you doing that? But I knew, I didn't have a single doubt in my mind when I knew I wanted to save the wasabi industry. I knew I wanted to eventually go into agriculture and the food world. And this was the perfect opportunity for me to bridge, the Japanese culture and agriculture with technology and bridge that with other countries like the US and Europe.
How did you meet Max, your co-founder, in the same workplace?
Yeah, so Max was actually in a similar industry. He went to Wharton, graduated, went to PE, so he really was an investor actually, and I was more, selling those investments. So we were on a different side. But he was an investor in actually early food and beverage companies as well as ag tech companies. So he actually had experience there. But we were friends since college. We went to different colleges, but my best friend from high school actually went to Wharton and was roommates with Max. So naturally, we would meet all the time at events, and we actually met in New York City. My birthday is August 21st, and Max is August 12th, so flipped. So we actually did a joint birthday party together in New York, and that's where we became really close. And realized, hey, he's looking for a Japanese founder because wasabi business, where do you start? As someone from the US, you just don't have cultivation knowledge. You don't have saplings. You don't have access to these farmers or the wasabi companies. So I think I was the perfect candidate for him. So he asked me, and I immediately said yes.
I see. As a like co-founder, Max and you, like, do you have like different strengths?
Oh, absolutely. We're, if anything, I would say, complete opposite. An American businessman really is good at showing confidence and, making big promises to investors, which is very, very important, right? You're trying to, as a seed round company, you don't have much to present. But with Max, I feel that I can dominate the world. And he really, makes me feel that way and sells the big dream that he has. As a Japanese businessman, we're the opposite. We're conservative. We underpromise and try to deliver more than what we promised. But in front of a VC, that's not always the right thing to do. You want to sell your big dream and get the best evaluation possible. And Max is truly, truly good at that.
Really?
Yes. So I would say that Max is a great leader in making this big dream and working small steps at a time, but getting there. I'm more of a conservative leader of, okay, let's not overpromise anything, but take small steps and hopefully deliver more than what we promised. So we have different management styles for sure. So, he wants to work incredibly quickly and achieve big things. I'm more, let's take our time, make sure let's do it correctly, and achieve smaller goals, which is, I think, a perfect match for us. Sometimes I'm too conservative, where I'm not selling a big enough dream, or I'm too pessimistic about an occurrence. But for Max, he's sometimes too optimistic. So we really balance each other out and have been able to raise some money earlier this year, as well as actually build out a system much quicker than I thought we would ever get to. So yeah, we do have our differences, but I think it really works out together.
You and Max have different strengths. You guys respect each other.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think respect is the number one thing. I mean, I actually am the COO and Max is the CEO, meaning he's number one, I'm number two. And I'm totally okay with that because I respect who he is. I respect his experiences. I respect his leadership. And I've already told him that when it comes to a big decision that we both strongly disagree on, at the end of the day, I'm going to, fold and agree to him because I trust that his decision, he's thought about it. I trust his intelligence. I trust that he's thought about it, and trust and respect is the number one thing. And of course, we get in fights. We do, but I think all good co-founders get in fights, and we always find a way to work it out together.
As a Cai Foods, you guys started, but before started, if I remember correctly, you guys visited the Wasabi farmer in Shizuoka and, hey, can we work in your place, right? Could you please share about this story?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a young founder, I don't have any previous experience or knowledge on wasabi, but to start a company, you have to be the expert in the industry and have to know about it more than anyone else. Better way to do it than to work at the farms. So Max actually moved to Japan before we started the company, and we lived together and we visited many wasabi farms. And wasabi farms are actually a very close-knit community and a secretive community. They're not willing to share their generational knowledge to the outsiders, which makes sense. They've made money that way, and that's something they were passed on through their family legacy. And I understand that you wouldn't want to share that with an outsider, so they even blur out their farm locations from Google Maps. That's how secretive they are. Yeah. So they're not willing to share much. So at first I would drive there. So I actually still worked at City then. So on the weekends I would rent a car, drive to Shizuoka, and just find wasabi farms and go talk to the farmers. Is how I started my journey. And every single one told them to get off the property. It's me. I mean, which makes sense. But I actually come from a farming family. So my family was able to introduce me to one wasabi farmer in Shizuoka. And of course, like, introductions carry such a big weight in startups. So I go from a stranger that's walking around in Shizuoka to someone that was introduced through a friend. So that trust aspect really helped. And I was able to get a tour at a farm. And during that tour, I shared my story and what I'm trying to do, and that I wanted to save the wasabi crisis. I wanted to really ignite agricultural innovation in that space because wasabi's production has declined 70% in the 20 years. And that's something I already researched. And I told them, hey, I want to be the change because the average farming population in Japan is 69 years old and they're not making any change, right? And no one's taking over either their businesses. So the farmer I visited actually had his stepson taking over the next generation, which was a rare case. So he really resonated with me and said, hey, like, actually what you're trying to do is great, and we're not competitors because you're trying to work in America and I'm a Japanese farmer, so if you're going to make wasabi more popular abroad, that's more business for me as well, is what the farmer said, which is true. So it mutually worked out. So he actually found it very interesting, taught me a lot about wasabi cultivation, and introduced me to 4 more farmers. And one of them was so kind and resonated with the story again that they took us in, Max and I both, free of charge, but we were able to work on their farms for 2 months. So we did everything from planting, trimming, harvesting, cleaning up the farms, making sure the water flows consistently, cutting trees, not mess up the farms, and we even hunted boars sometimes and deers because there would be animals on the farm that would deers and boars, they would come on the farms and run over the wasabi. They wouldn't eat the wasabi, but they would eat the bugs on the wasabi or just run over them. And after growing a plant for 2 years, having it ruined like that is it's a killer for the farmers. So we built up fences. So I did everything to do with wasabi cultivation, and I would say that's the foundation of my story. And on the very last day of our, I guess, training, the wasabi farmer was actually, asked us to invest in our company as well.
What?
Yeah, so he was like, hey, I saw you guys dedicate the last 2 months to working with us, and we didn't pay you a penny, and yet you were so adamant to learn. And he really wanted to cheer us on to succeed abroad and to bring the Japanese traditions abroad and to protect that heritage that they wouldn't be otherwise able to protect. So they were so kind to invest in us, and we still talk to them at least once a week and update them on how we're doing. And if any plants are not doing well, we'll go immediately to them and say, hey, this is a picture of our plant, it's not doing well, what can we do? And they're one of the greatest advisors we have.
This is awesome, Shun. You and Max, mission and passion, take action in 2 months, helping and eager to learn from their skill, and then made trust.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think especially in Japan, businesses are built based on trust. So you have, and honestly, I didn't, expect to gain any capital from them or have any investment in us, but I do believe that knowledge is the biggest investment they made in us. Even them giving us that is incredible. And going off that trust point, they actually trusted us to bring their genetics to the US as well. So we're able to grow wasabi genetics that have never been grown outside of Japan. So we are really, truly able to grow the Shizuoka brand, the Shizuoka genetics, and bring the exact clone to the US. So we're happy to say, we are US grown wasabi, but from a genetical standpoint, it's the exact same wasabi as the Japanese grown one. So we're able to provide these chefs and distributors in America the real wasabi, and not just real, I guess, wasabi species, but the exact species grown in Japan. Yeah.
The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Shun, part 2. 1. From trading floor to wasabi farm. Shun left a successful finance career in New York to pursue his route in agriculture. When he co-founder Max pitched the idea of America's first indoor wasabi farm, Shun quit his job on the trading floor that very morning. His leap shows the courage to leave stability behind to solve a mission-driven problem. 2. Landing a Michelin client without a product. Before Cai Foods even had a physical wasabi sample, Shun and Max secured their first 5 clients, including Michelin-starred restaurants. They achieved this by building trust, demonstrating deep knowledge of the global wasabi crisis, and convincing chefs and distributors of the value of a stable, authentic supply. This highlights the power of credibility and storytelling in early customer acquisition. 3. Earning trust in Japan's secretive wasabi world. Breaking into wasabi farming is so difficult. Japanese farmers are secretive and generational knowledge is rarely shared. By leveraging family farming ties, persistence, and genuine passion, Shun and Max were welcomed into Shizuoka farm, where they trained for 2 months. Their dedication and not only cultivation knowledge but also investment and access to authentic wasabi genetics, making their US wasabi identical to Japan's best. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. The next episode is the conversation with Shun part 3. Please stay tuned. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。